Mahatma Gandhi is quoted to have said, "I like your Christ, but I do not like Christians. Christians are so unlike their Christ." Why are Christians hypocrites? Okay, the question of the day today is this. It says, why does it seem like all Christians are hypocrites? They present themselves to be perfect and polished people, and when you get to know them, they are just as bad as anyone else. Great question. Let's dive into it and try to break it down. Now, it is no surprise that there has been no shortage of accusations of Christians being hypocrite. I would imagine that even from the very first century when Christianity began, there was accusations of Christians acting hypocritically in one way or another. And there's no shortage of that today. We see it all the time. I even remember when I was in high school, I was 18 years old, and I was going on a fishing trip with some buddies. And when we got there, I thought it would be great to have a case of pop beside me, and then to pull out a fat cigar, light a cigar, and just have a day of fishing. I think when I was 18, I thought I was being pretty cool. So when I pulled out that cigar, I remember my friend Sky he just went off on me. Like he read me the riot act. And he said, "How can you call yourself a Christian and then all of a sudden come on a fishing trip and want to pull out and smoke a cigar?" And at that very time, he called me the very thing. He said, "You're being a hypocrite." Now, we have no shortage of people that we've encountered that acted hypocritically, right? We've all been to a doctor where the doctor's like, you need to eat healthy, you need to live healthy, while they themselves are neither eating healthy or living healthy. Or maybe it's our parents who have told us to do one thing while they themselves, or they told us not to do one thing while they themselves do the very thing. I remember seeing a commercial back in the 80s, maybe early 90s. There was a dad standing over his son's bed. His son was a teenager, and he's holding a box of paraphernalia. And he said, "Where did you get this stuff? Who taught you how to do this stuff?" And the son was like, "You, okay? I learned it by watching you." And it said, "Parents who do drugs have kids who do drugs." And I'm thinking, hypocrisy, right? And this is the tension when it comes to hypocrisy that we have to wrestle with. If we encounter hypocrisy from so many people, why does it hurt so bad whenever we encounter hypocrisy from Christians? Well, let's break it down a little bit, and hopefully we can figure this out. Because when I look in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is talking to a group of religious leaders. They're called Pharisees. And 7 different times he calls these Pharisees hypocrites. And when Jesus uses the word hypocrite, I found out that he's saying something very different than we say when we say the word hypocrite, right? And so when we say the word hypocrite, we're just simply saying, hey, this is somebody who doesn't practice what they preach. They say they do one thing, or they say they believe one thing, but they go out and do something totally different. They have a double standard. But this wasn't what Jesus was saying when he was calling the Pharisees a hypocrite. When Jesus was calling the Pharisees a hypocrite, he was saying that they were doing something totally different. Now, the Greek word that Jesus used for hypocrite is hypokritos. And the word hypokritos literally just means stage performer or actor, which is a really crazy thing to call somebody who was a religious leader. Now, again, we use the word hypocrite as somebody who doesn't live out what they say they believe. But these religious leaders didn't do that. They were very devout in what they believed. So devout that they were nearly perfect in living out everything that they said they believe. And so when Jesus was saying that they were hypocrites, he wasn't saying they weren't living up to their own standard of belief. What he was saying was they were living those standards out for the wrong reason. And those reasons that the Pharisees were living out was because they wanted the status and recognition before people about how good they were. In other words, they were living for the applause of man. And that's what Jesus meant when he was calling the Pharisees hypocrites. So, what about us? Well, probably what we consider to be hypocrisy, or what we consider to be a hypocrite, is probably better understood as moral posturing. So what is moral posturing? Moral posturing is presenting oneself as being morally superior without embodying the values and behaviors of those very morals, right? That's what moral posturing is. So back to our question, why does it hurt so bad when Christians are guilty of moral posturing? Well, let me give you several reasons why I think that. When Christians morally posture themselves, what they are doing is they are actually showing contempt. What does that mean? What does contempt mean? To show contempt means that you are showing an element of superiority over another person. And so moral posturing is showing moral superiority over that of the person. Jesus said, we're not supposed to do this. He said, unbelievers do this all the time. He said, but not so with you. You're not to act that way. You are supposed to be gentle, kind, loving, compassionate, not morally superior than other people. I think the other reason why it hurts is because a lot of times when somebody is morally posturing themselves, they're justifying their own bad and hurtful behavior. Because if you've ever encountered somebody who was morally posturing in some way, they're using it as justification just to be hurtful and unkind. And that's terrible. It's a terrible reason it's just a terrible way to act towards anybody. Another one is that whenever somebody is morally posturing, they are acting exclusionary. They're drawing a line in the sand and they're saying, you're either for us or against us. And that's not what Jesus said to do at all. They're showing exclusion rather than showing hospitality. Jesus said, my followers will show hospitality. And so when you're excluding people, it becomes hurtful. I think the fourth reason is that whenever a Christian is morally posturing themselves against something or someone else, what they're doing is they are heaping guilt and shame on that other person, which is terrible because Jesus himself said he came to free us from guilt and shame. And so if Jesus came to free us from guilt and shame, how can we who claim to be Jesus followers take that same guilt and shame and try to put it back on other people? So when people say, well, I don't get it. Why do people even care if Christians are hypocrites? Everybody's hypocrites. Because when Christians are hypocrites, it becomes more damaging and more hurtful because you are living antithetically to everything that Jesus taught us how to live. And it hurts, and it does damage, and it excludes people, and it piles on them guilt and shame that they never deserved. So then, if that is the tension, the question then should be, what do we do about it? What do we do when we encounter Christians who are moral posturing? The reality of the situation is this: the only cure for moral posturing is humility and self-awareness. What are those? Humility is simply this. Humility is accepting responsibility and recognizing that you are guilty of doing that very thing. So when it comes to moral posturing, if you're going to humble yourself and have humility, that means that you're going to be like, yes, I have been guilty of moral posturing on people. I accept full responsibility at that. But humility is not enough. Self-awareness has to couple with it. Why? Because if humility is accepting that responsibility, self-awareness is discovering the root cause and the why behind, or the motivation behind why we were morally posturing in the first place. Excuse me. And so the only cure for moral posturing is humility and self-awareness. And so the truth is you will not be able to stop people who call themselves Christians from morally posturing. You will not be able to stop people who call themselves Christians from being hypocritical, because it's unfortunately something that Christians have been guilty of doing long before you and I ever existed. But what we can do is we can prepare ourselves to help diffuse the situation whenever we encounter it. How do we diffuse the situation of moral posturing? By humility and self-awareness. Now, it's not just the person who is acting that way who has humility and self-awareness, but when we encounter somebody who is moral posturing, if we show humility and self-awareness, it's something that ends up being contagious, because these things are better caught than taught. And so when we begin to take responsibility for ourselves, it opens up an environment where they can take responsibility for themselves. If we can understand our own motivation, it opens up an environment where they can begin to evaluate their own motivation. How? Why? Why does that work? Because humility and self-awareness both take a third component called vulnerability. And when there is contention versus contention, it is hard to show vulnerability in that kind of environment. But if we were able to approach a situation with our own level of humility and our own self-awareness, then we can begin to create an environment where the other person can begin to feel comfortable being vulnerable with us and start walking through this process of humility and vulnerability. Humility and self-awareness. Because when we begin to show that, then other people are invited into that. And you can't fight fire with fire. Jesus said you can't overcome evil with evil. You can only overcome evil with good. And so if we are going to cure any kind of moral posturing, we have to be able to cure it with humility and self-awareness.